defines that? How many dollars that we have to spend a day to see their own? So the question is, the truth be told, there were days when we had 2 meals a day and they were balanced meals a day. There were days we had 3 meals and we were balanced meals a day. So, but the food that we eat, is it the food that will be beneficial, like is mentioned, to us, our needs? Does it meet our needs? For example, now it's been said, it's going where you see rice, you see spaghetti, you see indomie, the noodles. These are not indigenous food to us. Somehow we are changing our meal, our diet, because we want to look like this. We need to consider what development is. What does development mean for us? So if we're talking about energy transition, we need to consider all of these things. What is development? What we define as growth and growth. So in our quest to industrialize, we have been burning more carbon, releasing more carbon. So still talking about energy and climate. If you look at this picture, what can you see here? What's happening here? There's fire, right? And what's happening here? They're wearing oxygen masks, trying to recreate the forest that should be outside that is burning. In the ideal sense, what should this family be doing? Thinking about doing right now? Find a way to put out the fire. But what are we doing today? Rather than talk about how we can put out this fire, we are developing technical fixes. What technology can we bring in to help us adapt to this? Instead of just simply finding a way to put out this fire. Transition and climate change balance that we talk about. In Dubai last year, I went to an exhibition where we saw a room where they had a digital tree. A tree in a glass, in a computer, depicting how the. So how will I preserve the tree in my village should be my point of concern. So any transition, looking at it from our perspective, needs to be taken from a different perspective. What development means, how we're going to preserve our environment and our home. Posting what is in the earth, under the earth is kept under, so that we can have a place for us to live. So in the conversation that's been ongoing in Africa, there's been a distorted logic. We said Africa contributes only 4% to the global greenhouse gas emission, right? You heard it, have you? And some of our leaders are thinking, if we have only contributed 4%, why don't we use the fossil fuel that we have to contribute more to the problem? But as we are the least producers or contributors to the greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere, we are also the most impacted. So what will common sense tell us? Or what should common sense tell us? Shouldn't we be thinking about how we can make sure that our vulnerability is not infringed upon, that we don't suffer more for the things that we do not cause? Or what do you think we should do? We should burn more fossil fuel and live inside the problem? So there's a distorted logic that we'll talk about in our next slide. So that's the question that many have said. Many African leaders have said, and I'm going to show you 2 quotes from 2 leaders. One from a current Nigerian president, and one from a Gambian minister, who said it in an article by the World Economic. Tinubu said during the campaign, we need to open our eyes. We need to tell the West, if they don't guarantee our finance and work with us to stop this climate change, we are not going to comply with their. You can imagine the distortion in a man's mind. Who is now the president of Nigeria? The other person said, under no circumstance are we going to be apologizing. Anybody out of the continent saying we should not develop those oil and gas fields is a criminal. So how do we ensure leaders don't lead us anymore? How do we ensure that these people's mindset is changed? Because they believe that the more money they amass, they can travel to Europe and move their family there while they live the rest of us. But this cannot sustain anybody because in the long run, Africa is our home. No matter if you have 10 citizenship, your final, your first place of call, they won't call you an American, they won't call you a British, they will first call you an African American or an African Briton. They cannot call you a British or an American. They must put that clause, African American. It tells you that regardless of where we are, home is home. How do we ensure that Africa is secure? How do we talk about this distorted logic? They say when you are in a hole, what's the best thing to do when you're in a hole? Stop digging. But what African leaders are saying, we are in a hole, let's keep digging. We'll find a way when we get to the base of the hole. How are we going to come out of that hole? So there is need for us to look critically at this logic that we are pushing forward in Africa. How do we ensure that we don't keep digging ourselves into the hole that is already causing us problems? The second rule of the laws of growth says if you find yourself in the hole, stop digging, come out of the hole, and cover the hole so we don't create problems for those coming ahead of us. But is that the case in Africa? No. But that's something that we need to start thinking about now and to ensure that we don't keep ourselves in the hole. So to move forward, there's need for us to understand where the rain began to be. Because if you want to know the future, you must know where you're coming from. You can't talk about the future if you don't know your past. There's need for us to consider it. How many of us know this story? Anyone? This story here. Anybody? That's the Berlin Convention, where they sat down together and shared Africa. And they did that gathering, not for the benefit of you and me, but they did that petition so they will not fight with themselves. So they can know where my boundary is, I know where your boundary is, so we will not fight. But since they began colonizing in the past, in different parts of Africa, what have we seen? They don't make us gather together in a space to define our boundaries. Rather, they make that benefits only us. And they agreed on how to share. But what have they done to us in Africa? Rather than make us, or we looking at the situation together as Africans, they have set us in different motions to cause the divide, using the divide and rule to make us begin to fight each other while they extort us or exploit us. So there are many issues that we need to talk about. Colonialism is one of them. And colonialism doesn't left African countries. It's still here. They are doing it now by remote control, which we now call new colonialism. We need to understand this, be able to fight this hydra, this drug. So just to show you, just to reiterate, that's what the conference was about. The most important part for me was Europeans called the Berlin meeting because they felt rules were needed to prevent war over claims of the African land. So that's why this is the major part of why they did this. So because of this colonial activity, Africa became an exploitation port. All the so-called mining, extraction that happened on the continent were not meant for use on the continent. If you check, I don't know if it's the same here, but in Nigeria, any part where you see in the forest that has a tarred road, for sure, that tarred road leads to a resource that leads to the sea. And if you look at it, the networks, can you see any of these networks when they're coming into Africa? Any of the red lines, is anyone coming into Africa? They are all channeled, either the fringes out, not for use, for the benefit of Africa. So to make sure in this process of talking about energy transition, how do we ensure that whatever happens in Africa, first and foremost, benefits Africa before we think about benefiting others? How do we change this narrative of making Africa an exploitation port of Europe, America, China, as we are having it today? That's a conversation that we need to have. When Kwame was speaking, he talked about the West African gas pipeline. There are different pipelines in Africa. I need to check all of them. Does anyone go back into Africa? Does anyone go back into Africa? They are all out to the sea, moving resources, crude oil, gas from within the continent out to Europe. If you look at this trans-Saharan gas pipeline that was supposed to run from Nigeria to Algeria down to through Niger and to Morocco and off to Spain and Italy. The same route. None was meant to be used in Africa. The East African gas pipeline is causing problems. A country like Tanzania, the only thing they have is gas. But two major pipelines passing through that place, and they have experienced oil spill, even if they don't have crude oil in their place. Several fights have happened. Several people have been killed in Uganda, arrested along this pipeline, just moving gas from within the continent out to Europe. If you look at the Nigeria-Morocco pipeline, is anyone coming to the country? No, they are all meant for export. So the more we start thinking about these things, how can we ensure that what is made from Africa stays in Africa, or how can we ensure that our resource, our energy resource, is used for the benefit of us and to help us ensure that we don't stay in this catastrophe called climate change and its impact. In Nigeria, for example, just to portray that, Nigeria exported 9.09 million metric tons of LNG, liquefied natural gas, to Europe in 2022. In 2023, it was almost the same figure. 2.7 million metric tons left for Spain, 1 million metric tons left for Portugal, as well as the Asian market. In total, about 14.7 million metric tons of liquefied natural gas left the continent, left Nigeria, to Europe and to Asia. And see how many was left in the country for them to use. 400,000 metric tons compared to 14.7 million metric tons. So who benefits from our gas? Who benefits from our oil? Europe. So how do we change this trajectory? How do we make sure this stops? It's part of our discussion today. As Nimo will always say, extraction on the continent is vastly for export. The already installed and planned infrastructure for exploitation all leads to this import. And this map shows it all. So how do we make sure this comes to an end? It's part of our discussion. Fadel Kabu said, we can't decarbonize a system that has not been decolonized yet. So as part of the transition, our energy transition we're talking about, we have to think about how do we free ourselves from these colonial masters and the coloniality that is embracing us. Many people in Africa believe if it's not from abroad, it's not real. How do we change that mindset? We need to discuss how to decolonize our minds, colonize the system, before we talk about energy transition. So now, what does energy transition hold for Africa? First, opportunity available to us to decolonize the systems that have been shaped by the colonial master. This is an opportunity for everyone of us. How do we decolonize? It's an opportunity for us to determine how do we want to go. What form of development do we need to have? Africa needs to have a plan for Africa, not Europe plan for Africa, or American plan for Africa, or Asian plan for Africa. What is the African plan for Africa? We need to, all of us, determine and decide what that is. Africa cannot continue to play the role of a source of cheap raw material, a dumping ground for the products made abroad, a low-cost tourism. Now, if they want to come and enjoy life for cheap, they will fly to Africa, to our tourist place. But if you have to fly from Nigeria or from Togo to any part of Europe, they are going to pay $3. It's very expensive. But coming to Africa is a cheap place for them to have their tourism and enjoyment. And we must find a way to stop this from happening. Energy transition is an opportunity for us to tackle energy poverty. They have said that over 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity. How do we ensure that in this transition to clean renewable energy, the energy that we are producing is going to be used for Africans by Africans, the benefit of it? It's something to talk about. That will help us kill energy poverty. If we don't decide on our long-term strategy, we are also going to remain in the same sector. So in this transition to clean renewable energy, do we want them to also come to Africa, exploit the mineral resources that we have, take it back to their country, refine it, and bring it back to us to buy? Look at the beautiful solar panels on that roof. Who made them? Where were they made from? Not Africa. We imported them. The materials for those panels came from Africa, but the finished product came from outside. We'll talk about this. So Africa is said to have very huge amount of renewable energy potential. How do we ensure that we don't go back to the same cycle of the fossil fuel, where people's environment are polluted, where lands are grabbed, where people have lost their lives and their life? We need to talk about how this renewable energy will be tapped in Africa and for whose benefit. I'm just trying to conclude. Let's rush through all of this. So we'll talk about how to decentralize the system and make sure it is people-centered and not commercial. So in conclusion, energy transition cannot happen without upholding the principles of justice. There must be human rights, environmental, social, economic, or socio-economic justice. We must put this at the middle, at the front, and behind our conversation, the energy transition. There must be fairness. Those who have contributed the most to this crisis that we are facing today have to lead in the process of cutting their emission at source, while also providing the finance that will help all of us to transit with cleaner energy forward. There has to be equity. We must understand that principle of common but differentiated responsibility and different capabilities. We need to uphold that principle. Those who have caused the problem should be the ones who need to provide the finance. Energy transition in Africa must be people-led, people-centered, and void of market mechanism. It must be a decentralized system. Energy transition for the people of Africa must put the issue of access. Access for the people to have reliable, affordable, adequate access to energy services that is culturally suitable for every one of us. Look at this room. If you turn on this air conditioning and open the windows, you can still live in this room without stress. That's how we used to build. These brick walls will help us keep this place cool. But because we want to emulate and look like we have changed the way we build, we change the buildings that we have that will not suit our own being, our own needs. Let's talk about how to change that. We must prioritize efficiency. How do we make sure that our energy is not wasted? How do we make sure that we don't waste energy in this transition? And how do we ensure that this is secure? For example, look at the solar grid. In communities where they have small solar systems, centralized systems, they are able to manage their resources by themselves. Compared to the central system where you have to produce energy, supply to the central grid, and having this centralized system will help our communities own this energy system, manage it for themselves, and going to take care of it the way they want and be there. So just to round up quickly, we must also reject all forms of false solution. They have been calling gas transition fuel. Gas is still a fossil fuel. It's still going to release methane. And we must do all we can to fight that. Gas should not be a part of the transition. We should also reject all forms of geoengineering and other false solutions, like that picture I showed you. Instead of talking about free techno fixes, find a way to put out fire. African government must make the right demands of the global. They must demand that they pay the climate debt holders. It's been said that the amount of money spent on military hardware, funding the war going in Israel, they are killing people in Gaza. There are thousands every day. The war from Russia and Ukraine, the amount of dollars spent on this warfare has been calculated to be about $2 trillion. So if this money is paid back to Africa, smaller nations who are faced with this climate change impact to help us in the transition. And with African leaders need to join us to demand for that. We also talk about the pledges that have been made by different governments. We have to push that they pay these different pledges. And lastly, it's essential for planetary justice and for African people that African change is energy development pathway. We need to decide how we need to develop. We must move away from harmful fossil fuel towards transform energy system that is clean, renewable, democratic, and actually serves the people. Deploy decentralized renewable solutions over the 800 million people who are without power. 85 of them who live in rural areas, and making sure that their livelihoods are preserved. So I will end here by saying we must pick a side because there are consequences if we don't pick a side. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à Wale pour cette présentation qui a planté le décor. Je pense que nous avons eu beaucoup d'informations et j'estime également que nous avions beaucoup de questions. Mais nous allons procéder, nous allons prendre une petite pause, une pause café, et revenir maintenant, prendre les questions. Et s'il y a aussi des commentaires ainsi que des contributions, ce sera le moment de le faire. On est assis, ça fait déjà 1 heure dépassée. On va se lever, aller gentiment au dehors, prendre quelque chose pour avoir assez d'énergie pour la suite. Mais avant ça, nous allons aussi profiter prendre la photo de famille et puis faire la pause. Merci beaucoup. Il est 10h38, donc nous devons finir la pause et reprendre les travaux à 10h50, s'il vous plaît. À 10h50, nous devons revenir et continuer la suite du programme, notamment les questions par rapport à la présentation que Wale vient de vous faire. Merci beaucoup.